Hi, this is Randy. I want to welcome you to my page. I hope that you enjoy it, get something out of it. We'd sure like to have you click and subscribe and click the thumbs up button and let people know you enjoyed it. It'll push it out into the rhythm and we'll get more viewers to watch our program if you help us out. I appreciate it. We're going to talk today about the agony of guilt. At some time or another in life, everybody faces guilt, whatever it may be. And we're going to talk about David here and how David faced guilt. And I'm going to be reading in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 1. Then the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said, "There are two men in one city, and one rich and the other poor." Now Nathan was a minor prophet. He was sent to talk to David by God and to talk to him about sin that he had in his life. Now, the agony of guilt sometimes might overtake us if we allow it to. You feel guilty about things. Many funerals I've preached, to give you an example, people will go up to the casket and say, "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't come home more often. I'm sorry I haven't called you in over a year. And Mom can't hear you." It's trying to ease your guilt that you feel because you feel you didn't do right by your mother. And so you're talking, and it's too late. If you're going to give, as my mom used to tell me, if you're going to give me roses, give them to me while I'm alive so I can smell them and enjoy them. Don't bring flowers out to my grave after I'm gone. It does nothing for me. I don't know nothing about it. And like I told you in one of my other videos, Dad said take any money you would spend on flowers, help someone in need, food, gas, whatever, help them out. So that's what we've done in our family. But many people feel guilt when there's a death in the family and they say, "Well, I wished I'd helped Dad out more. You know, he was out there. I drove by a few times, saw him out there in the yard. He was really struggling. Dad was up there. He's about 86. Well, why didn't you pull in the driveway and help him out? Why didn't you hop up and say, 'Dad, get off the tractor,' or 'Dad, put that mower down. I'll take care of it for you,' instead of standing at his casket saying, 'Dad, I wished I would have helped you. Dad, I wished I would have done that.'" The wishing time's over. When people die, it's too late. If you're going to do something for somebody, do it now so you don't have guilt later because you didn't do it. And we need to realize that. In Psalms 32 and 3 it says, "When I kept silent, my bones grew old through my groanings all the day long." David was talking about the guilt that he was feeling. What else is there in times of guilt but silence? We can't talk to people sometimes about our guilt. Even those closest to us, our family members. We can't talk to God at times. In Psalm 66, verse 18, it says that it tells us that if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. So if you have hard feelings and you hate people, or you have hard feelings toward them, you hold hard feelings, you're stopping God. You're blocking the blessing because you have iniquity in your heart, because the Bible tells us, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. God's not going to hear your prayers if you go around hating people and being mad at people and all that. Why do you think the Bible tells us don't let the sun go down upon your wrath? If you're mad at someone, take care of it. That's what the Bible's trying to tell you. Take care of it now. Don't wait another day. What if you get up tomorrow and say, "Well, I'm going to call them and apologize to them," and you call over there and his wife says, "I'm sorry. During the night he got sick and he passed away." You missed your opportunity. You say, "Well, you're kind of going drastic and this and that." Well, I'm just trying to tell you the truth. I have met people over the years of preaching that have regretted. You see it always at funerals. There's always regrets. I wished I would have done this. I wished I would have done that. I'm not bragging on me. I know me. I don't know you. But I gave my mother flowers while she was alive. After my dad passed, when I was running a big dealership and evangelizing, I would go by every Thursday. That was my day. I'll pick my mom up, take her out for a ride, take her out to lunch. Then I go home and say, "Mom, is there anything I can do for you?" Because I gave my dad my word. 3 or 4 days before he passed, I would always watch after my mother and take care of her. And that's why I wouldn't move. I stayed right there, close in the neighborhood, so I could keep an eye on my mom. Why? I made a promise. The Bible says better not to make a promise than to make one and break it. And I sure wasn't going to break the promise to my father. I respected him more than any man I've ever met in my life. And I wasn't going to break my promise to him to watch after my mother. And when my mother passed, I felt no guilt. I bought her flowers. I went by and seen her. I called her every day. Mom, is there anything you need? Are you all right? I'm getting ready to leave work 10 o'clock at night. I called my mom because I knew she wasn't in bed. She was a night owl. And I said, I'm getting ready to come home. Would you like me to pick something up and bring it to you? Or do you need something from me? While I was on the road, I had a bag phone back in those days. Can you believe that? It was a bag plugged in a cigarette lighter. And I call her and say, I'm on my way home. I'm almost out of Illinois. I'm heading over to Missouri. You won't need anything. Why? Because I loved my mother. I wanted no regrets. And I did the same thing with my father. I had no regrets. Why? Because I made things right when they were alive. Folks, if you're going to get rid of guilt out of your life, you need to do it while people are alive, and you need to do it while you're able to do it. You may not be able to do it tomorrow. You may not be able to do it next week. You might get too sick or whatever. You never know. It was no small thing for David, a man who kept counsel with God continuously and on every subject you can think of, and he didn't like the guilt and the silence that he got and he had in his life. But David created that by sinning and by doing what God didn't want him to do. Have you ever done something you shouldn't have done? Have you ever zigged when you should have zagged? I'm telling you, sometimes we do things in life that we shouldn't do. The only sound David heard was his own groaning as he was groaning like very dry bones because of the old thoughts and the guilt that he was carrying for the things that he was doing wrong. He took another man's wife. He had the man killed on the battlefield. David did some despicable things that he should have never done, but he did it anyway. And so he was living guilt and carrying guilt. We don't want to go through life carrying guilt. No one's more eloquent with words than David was, and of his sufferings. And he wrote in Psalms 32 and 4, for day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was turned into the drought of summer. He was feeling guilt. He was beat down. He was feeling like he was all dried up and had nothing left in him, and that he was barren. Why? Because he had sinned against God. He had done a horrible thing, not only lusting after another man's wife, but also arranging the murder of her husband so he could marry her and hide from everybody what had went on with the woman. And so David did a horrible thing, and David felt so much guilt. Have you ever done anything in life you felt guilty about? Guilt is terrible, and if you carry it with you all the time, it can destroy you. And so David had at his beck and call the army. He had a big kingdom. He had a palace. He had many wives and concubines, and he could call anybody to help him and do whatever he wanted to do. David was trapped inside his own guilt. With all this at his disposal, he still was ate up with guilt because he knew he had sinned against God and that he sinned against himself, and he was all tore up over it. And David was in much sorrow, and it was sapping him of his life. It was making him discouraged. It was beating him down, and he was losing every bit of shred of happiness he had in life. And there was no reason for him to dance anymore. There was no reason for him to sing anymore because he was carrying this grief and guilt that he had from what he had done. Secrecy sometimes eats you up. When people ask you, if I tell you this, will you keep it secret? Then you need to keep it secret. And because if somebody's secrets get out that they share with a personal friend or a brother or two sisters or whatever, they ought to keep it. If they say, I'm telling you this because I need to tell somebody, but I don't want you to tell nobody, you shouldn't tell nobody. You should, if you give your word, you ought to do what your word says. You shouldn't lie about it and say, I'll keep it secret, and then tell somebody. I had a guy one time, he goes, do you think I can trust my brother? I want to talk to him and see if he'll keep a secret. I really got things bothering me, and I'd really like to talk to him about it. I don't feel comfortable talking to you because you're a minister, and you'll frown upon me and think bad about me. I've done some real bad things. And I said, well, or this is something you want to keep a secret? He said, yes, it is. I said, well, it'll be a secret till you tell somebody. I said, so I'm going to give you that little piece of advice right now. If you're not talking to a minister who swore to keep your confidentiality and you're going to talk to your brother, do you trust your brother? He goes, well, pretty much so. I said, well, it's a secret till you tell somebody. So if you want to keep a secret, don't tell nobody. If you do, you better know them and know that they're going to keep it secret, and you do for them and they do for you. Everybody needs a sounding board once in a while, somebody they can talk to, they can turn to, besides the Lord. Sometimes we need to talk to a human being about things right now. And so there's nothing wrong with that, but just make sure it's somebody that you can trust and somebody that will keep your confidence and they'll do for you what you would do for them. And we need to avoid as much problems as we can, and we need to ask God for advice and seek the Lord and let the Lord know that we love him and we're sorry that we messed up. We're sorry that we sinned. The king spent a year living with intolerable secret. He spent many nights not sleeping. Psychologically, he was exiled from God, and he was away from people, and he just didn't know what to do. He was ate up with guilt because of his sin and what he had done. So the Lord, what did the Lord do? Finally, God reached out to David, and he offered him a way out of his mess and out of his misery and out of his guilt. He provided a instantaneous answer to his problems. He sent Nathan to him to talk to him, and the accusation of guilt came to him in 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 1. It says, as I said earlier, and the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he sent it to him, and he told David a story about a man who was rich, and he had he had hundreds and lots of lambs, and a poor man only had one. And he had somebody coming, they were going to throw a party, so he took the poor man's one lamb and killed it to cook for his big party. And David said, that man that did that, he was really mad because a man did that. And Nathan pointed his finger right in David's face and says, you're the man. You're the one that did that. You had all these wives and concubines, and what did you do? You stole another man's wife, and then to cover it up, you had him murdered. And David was Johnny on the spot to look him in the eye and admit his guilt and what he had done. In verse 13 it says, then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has also taken away your sin, and you shall not die. Why? Because God wanted him to admit his sin and admit his guilt and get it over with. He carried that for a year. He could have got rid of it a year earlier by just admitting what he did, asking for forgiveness, telling the Lord to help him and to forgive him. But David was ate up. Guilt will eat you up if you feel guilty. There's many things you can feel guilty about. If you've done somebody wrong, you cheat them out of money. And it was years ago. I had a guy call me one time, about 7 or 8 years after it happened. He went to my dad and mother's church and was a member, and he hired me to do some work. And I was working for him, and I was building retaining walls with railroad ties. I was in high school. Minimum wage was $1.60 an hour, and I was pulling down $1.60 an hour. I thought I was in tall cotton. Well, I got 3 or 4 paychecks. Finally, one week he said, well, I got to put these in the bank. I got to do this. I can pay you next week. And then next week turned into next week. Next week turned into next week. Pretty soon I'm 6 weeks down the road. I told him I'm not going to work another day till you pay me. Well, he had asked me earlier in the summer, do you have any friends that would help out because we've got more jobs to do? So I told him about this friend I went to school with. So he called him up and hired him, and then he drug him along as far as he could until he wouldn't work no more without being paid. And then the summer was over, we had to go back to school, and he cheated us both. I worked 40 to 50 hours a week at $1.60 an hour. I was supposed to get time and a half for over 40, and he beat me out of the money. Well, when I confronted him, he said I was a liar. I wasn't telling the truth. And then his wife said I was a liar. And then his dad, who went to our church, called, and he told me to quit lying about his son. He was all upset at me and everything else. I said, well, it isn't a lie. I said, I wasn't going around telling everybody in church, but I told him, and his dad heard me. So anyways, and this guy was, like 35 or 38 years old. He wasn't a kid. And I was, 17. And so about 7 or 8 years later, I get a phone call. These people had moved out of town. They didn't go to the church no more. They didn't leave mad. They just moved back to where they came from years ago. And he called me and he said, my son wants to talk to you and he's really embarrassed. And I said, who is this? And he told me who he was. I said, okay, well, about what? I mean, right then I couldn't think, 7 or 8 years. I mean, I don't remember everything that happened, 7 or 8 years ago. And sometimes I can't remember what I ate last Tuesday. And so anyway, he said, well, he wants to talk to you, and he put him on the phone. And he said, I told my mother and father today that I cheated you out of your wages, that you did work 6 weeks, you never got paid a penny for it. You averaged about 50 hours a week. I owed you $1.60 an hour for 40 hours a week, plus I owed you $2.40 an hour for the 10 hours overtime. And he said, I never paid you. And I told him I lied, I worked you, and I cheated your friend too. And I said, oh, and he goes, my dad wants to get on the phone. So he handed the phone to his dad. By this time, the guy's in his 40s, all right? So his dad gets on the phone and he goes, I want to apologize to you. I called you a liar, and I told you you wasn't truthful. And he goes, I'm sorry. My son misled me. He did that. I said, look, I got no hard feelings. That's water under the bridge, and it is what it is. He goes, well, he really feels bad about it. I said, okay, well, can you put him back on the phone? So they put him back on the phone, and I said, your dad tells me you really feel really guilty and bad about it. He goes, well, I do. I said, then why don't you pay me? And he wasn't inclined to go that far with his thing. He just said, well, I don't have the money. I said, okay, no problem. I'm forgiving you the debt. I forgive you. I forgave you a long time ago for what you did to me. But I'm forgiving your debt. You owe me nothing. You don't have to pay me back. We're good, okay? He goes, you're not mad at me? I go, no, we're good. So I told him, have a nice day. Hung up, never heard another thing from him the rest of my life, and don't know where he's at or what he's doing or if he's even alive. But he was, he was quite a bit older than me, about 17 to 19 years, probably something like that. But his guilt had been eating him up for a long time. He asked me if I knew how to get a hold of my friend. I said, no. After we got out of high school, I lost track of him. I said, I know he got married and he moved out to the county. He don't live in the city no more, but I don't know. Well, if you ever run into him, you tell him I'm sorry and that I cheated him. I said, sure, I'll tell him and all that. Never did see my friend or hear from him, but he did tell me. And what I'm trying to do is show you that guilt will eat you up. That had been bothering him for 7 years, and it was finally eating him up to the point where he called me a long distance, and he wanted to tell me he was sorry and asked me to forgive him. Why? Because he was dealing with all this guilt. You need to deal with your guilt. You can't keep it inside of you. It'll eat you up. And so David had to admit that he was guilty and admit that he had sinned against God. People don't like to use it. Most preachers on the TV now, it's all, well, they made a poor choice. He made a poor choice. No, he sinned. I'll just call it what it is. He sinned. Sin is sin. They try to candy coat everything. I don't know why in the world they do that. In Psalms 51 and verse 12 it says, restore to me the joy of your salvation and sustain me with a willing spirit. David needed to have restoration. He needed to be restored back to where he was and ask God to forgive him for his sins and what he had done wrong. And David had to accept the responsibility and admit that he was guilty and that he did wrong. And Nathan brought the relief that he needed. You're the one. You're the one. Just like this man that took that lamb, you took one. And you had her husband killed. And he admitted his guilt. And he said, I've sinned against God and I've hurt myself and I want to be forgiven. We need to realize that we need to acknowledge our sin and ask for forgiveness. David could have just said that a long time ago before that and been done with it, but he didn't do it. He felt isolated, he felt sinful, he was miserable, and he felt that he couldn't do things, and he was cut off from God. He no longer had a song in his heart. He no longer had any praise on his lips because he was living in guilt from sin. I'm telling you today, before I close this, if you've sinned and you've done something wrong, ask God to forgive you. If it's against somebody, try to get a hold of them if you can. If it's, if you can't, you can't. But if it's a friend or was a friend or a relative, try to let them know, hey, I'm sorry, and ask for their forgiveness. If they don't forgive you, you're off the hook. It's on them then. They got a problem, not you. But you need to deal with it and ask God to forgive you of your sin and put it behind you and say, God, I don't want to live this way no more. I don't want to live in guilt no more. I don't want to live with this sin hanging over my head. I want you to forgive me. And so, as I close today, let me tell you something. Don't let the agony of guilt eat you up and ruin your life, but ask God to forgive you of your sin, and God will do it. Don't make God have to send a Nathan to you to stick his finger up in your face and tell you what you've done. You know what you've done. So ask for forgiveness. We all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Everybody's sinned. I saw a preacher on YouTube a few weeks ago. He was on there bragging, I have never sinned since I got saved. I don't know how many years it was, 18 years or 28 years or something. I've never looked at a woman with lust. I've never sinned and all that. And I thought, boy, you are sinning right now because you're telling a lie. I mean, nobody goes through their life without sinning. That don't mean you have to do it. When Jesus came, you don't have to kill a guy, but in your heart, if you wished he was dead, you already killed him. You follow what I mean here? So Jesus has a different set of rules that there was, but prior to that, all you got to do is, well, I wished I could sleep with her. Oh man, I'd like to see her in a bikini. You're sinning already. You don't have to go over and do nothing. You did something already in your heart. And if I could kill him and get away with it, I would. You ever heard anybody say that? I have. Well, you just did, and in God's eyes, you just murdered him. So we need to realize, be careful what you say. And if you've sinned and done something wrong, make it right with God. And if you can make it right with somebody, you do it. Because I knew a guy, my dad knew a guy that was a friend of his that stole a saddle for a horse from a guy. And he had it for several years. And he finally went to the Lord and went in the church, confessed what he did in front of the church, which he didn't have to do. He asked God to forgive him. They prayed with him. And then my dad goes, you got one more thing to do. He said, what? I said, take that saddle back to that man. And he goes, oh, God, I hate to do that. I look him in the face. He said, you need to do it. So he took the guy's saddle back to him, and it had been like 8 or 10 years. And he said, and the guy didn't remember at first. And he said, you remember this saddle? And then finally the guy goes, yeah. He goes, I stole your saddle. He goes, I know. I was working for you for a couple of months in the summer, and I stole your saddle. And he said he wanted to give it back to him. And the man said, no, you've had it this long. Evidently you use it. You can have it. I forgive you, and patted him on the shoulder. And the guy wept. He told my dad, I've been so guilty for all these years, and it bothers me every night, and I get sick to my stomach because I stole that saddle. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want him to know I took it. And he had wrestled on something. This guy, what did he do? He said, that's okay. Patted him on the shoulder. God forgives you, and so do I. You just keep this saddle. You've had it all this years. I don't need it. And all this time he was beating himself up. So don't do that to yourself. Ask God to forgive you. And then one last thing, forgive yourself. Now, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you I appreciate you coming and watching this. I appreciate you if you would hit the like button, if you would subscribe to the channel. We're just new. I'm doing my best. We're trying to get going. We can really use your help. And I appreciate it. Thanks for your time. This time, till next time, so long. Have a great day.